Okay, so welcome to Tech Canada's Deeper Insights webinar series. I'm Brittany Fitzgerald, Delta Coordinator here at Tech Canada, and I'm thrilled to be your host for today's session. For this webinar, we have the privilege of hosting Francis Gosselin, a Tech Canada speaker, economist, consultant, and journalist. He's worked with leaders for 15 years, supporting organizations in Canada, Europe, and the United States in their strategic planning exercises. He's moderated hundreds of executive offsites and given countless lectures on macroeconomic trends from regional to global. So a few weeks ago, we did have the pleasure of Francis hosting a webinar completely in French that did unveil some pivotal factors that shapes Quebec's economic landscape over the next 2 years. And he shared his strategic recommendations to help leaders navigate the evolving challenges and opportunities ahead. So today we are excited to welcome him back as he shares his insights in English with new examples, economic data, the most relevant for business leaders in Alberta, Saskatchewan, British Columbia, Ontario, and the Maritimes. And so without further ado, let's dive into the insightful content and extend a warm welcome to Francis, and welcome.
Thank you, Brittany. I'm just gonna share my screen. Here we go. And full screen. Are you seeing this okay? So, good morning and or lunchtime to everyone. I'm Francis, and I'll be talking to you guys for the next 40 or so minutes about the future. When talking about the future, I always like to talk a little bit about the past, so we'll get started on that right away. I invite you, if you have any questions, to ask them either if you're on LinkedIn or directly in the Zoom call in the chat, and we will have plenty of time at the end of the session today to chat and to debate if that is necessary. So looking at the next couple of years, I always like to talk a little bit about myself at first. So I was born in the early 80s, and why is that significant? I will be using some data looking back to the early 80s to tell you basically how the world is evolved and where it is likely to evolve over the next 2 to 5 years. And as I said, I always like to look back before I look forward, and so it does coincide with my lifetime, but it's just a coincidence. Basically, I think the story that we can tell from 1980 to today is a very interesting one. And again, when we look forward, we can take a lot of cues from what happened in that period. So our plan for today, I'll talk a little bit about what I call the perfect storm. Obviously, pre, during, and post-pandemic, what has happened, what is likely to happen now that we're kind of out of the storm, and whether or not there are still some impacts to be felt in the economic area. Second, I'll talk a little bit about labor and housing. As you certainly know, these are two of the very critical topics for the Canadian economy right now. So I'll be talking about that, showing a few numbers and thinking about what comes next. Talking a little bit about retail, I think it's very significant. As you may or may not know, we are kind of on the verge of a recession. The GDP growth has been very slow over the past few quarters, and I think one of the key explanations is to look deeper into what's happening in retail. I will be talking about manufacturing and services throughout the presentation, but I wanted to focus really on retail for a short section. And then, looking forward, what comes next and what should we keep our eye on as entrepreneurs, as business leaders, as community facilitators, etc. So the perfect storm starts for me on March 13th, 2020. You may remember that day. In most provinces, it was the day where we decreed a shutdown of the economy, a lockdown, a very strict restriction historically of our ability to move around, which again, you can be for or against, but it was unprecedented, at least in my lifetime, and for most of the current people that are on the market. And what changed? Basically, well, several things changed, but I think one of the very significant thing that we have to keep in mind, especially from the point of view of entrepreneurs and leaders throughout the Canadian economy, is that there was a very deep and structural change into how our preferences were expressed on the market. And one such example is our bank rush towards toilet paper in pretty much every city, every market. You have to think about what this says of people's very deep worry about the future, about their ability to be self-sustaining. And I think something broke basically in our system of preferences during the pandemic. And again, this is like the tip of the iceberg. What you have to consider, I think, as business leaders is that the toilet paper example is just, again, a very small symbol of everything that happened in a bunch of other industries. And I like to give the example of Peloton, which you may know is a bicycle manufacturer, a stationary bicycle manufacturer. Over a very short period of time, starting in September 2019, as the pandemic was kind of growing up, the company's price stock was multiplied by, grew by 500%. So basically what that means, obviously, is that you have to grow your production capacity, your inventory, your staff, your square footage, your liquidity requirements, etc., by 3, 4, 5 times, right? And the thing is that although it's growing really, really fast for a short period of time, eventually the pandemic comes to pass and it just falls basically just as quickly, if not more, because now a lot of people who didn't really want a stationary bicycle have bought one because they were bored, because they were caught at home. And so you actually end up at a lower point than you were before the pandemic. And so as producers, as manufacturers, as leaders, either business, political, it's very difficult to determine a proper strategy when you're faced with periods of extreme volatility like this one. The funny thing throughout this period is that we were really trying hard at flattening the curve, right? The flattening the curve of COVID cases, which is, again, a great objective, collective and common objective. But in doing so, what we did is that we flattened one curve, the COVID cases, but we basically exploded every other curve. And that's been really destabilizing for a lot of individuals and a lot of businesses as well. As we were walking out, or just kind of dealing with and finally, getting on the other side, the downward slope of the pandemic, and as vaccination proceeded quite swiftly throughout Canada, we were hoping to, land on a kind of a better position as a nation and as an economy. And then obviously things happened. The first one of which is that Russia invaded Ukraine. And so, I mean, there's the war side of this, there's the geopolitical aspects of this, but if you bring it back just to the economic aspect, well, obviously, as you may remember, the price of oil spiked very, very quickly in the beginning of 2022. And so that, went all the way to $120 a barrel for the Brent. And that's interesting because at the beginning of the pandemic, you'll remember, if you look to the left-hand side of the graph, we had actually had negative prices for a couple of days in which people would pay you to take barrels of oil because they didn't have any more room to put it. So basically, we went from a negative price to kind of a record price over a very short period of time, which obviously, in terms of energy policy and in terms of price policy, is something that's very difficult to manage. Another example that's kind of a fallout from the Russian-Ukrainian conflict is the price of wheat, obviously, which exploded almost twofold. And wheat obviously comes into a lot of, people's food dietary requirements, but it also feeds livestock, so that creates a kind of a bubble that feeds onto itself. Fortunately, it did not last. There were some solutions, but it really depends on what country you are. Some countries are still significantly affected by that. And another kind of deep consequence of that is that fertilizer prices went up really fast, again, in large part due to the Ukrainian invasion by Russia. And again, fertilizers are basically one of these key factors of production that go into a lot of what we eat, into a lot of what we consume. And so when you have this kind of central factor of production that goes up really, really quickly, it has a secondary impact on a lot of things that are crucial to the economy that have a very low elasticity price of demand, basically that even if the price goes up, you still consume pretty much the same. That is true for oil and gas, and it's true for food. Obviously, you will not reduce your dietary requirements because the price has gone up by 10%. You will just dedicate more of your income to that and less to other things. And so again, another factor, Russia was one. The other factor was China. And obviously, two things in China. The first is obviously that their zero COVID policy went on for a lot longer than most other countries. Their vaccination campaign was a catastrophe. I think even to this day, there's about 60% of the Chinese population that's been vaccinated, whereas in most other developed countries, it's 80, 90. I think in Canada, we're above 90%. And so obviously, that's created a problem because we depend on China for a lot of the inputs into our own economy as Canadians, in the American economy as well. So that's jacked up prices. It's created a problem with supply. The other dimension in China, obviously, apart from COVID, is the geopolitical situation. It's partly economic, partly due to their strategies and their behaviors internationally. The situation with Taiwan, the situation with Uyghurs, with Tibet, etc. And so, for that reason, we've addressed China in a very haphazard way in the past few years. But one thing that we did decide, Joe Biden decided last year, is to really cut down on the ability of certain companies to export semiconductors to China. So basically, as you can see on these, there's a series of sanctions that came to be. And so that limited China's ability to import semiconductors, but then as a secondary impact, it limited their ability to generate productivity gains and then eventually to kick back and to relaunch their economy. And so again, these were very significant changes into the worldwide scenario, worldwide portrait. And so these things altogether, obviously, have revived kind of a conflictual situation with Taiwan. And again, we don't really know what's going to happen there. But as you know, Taiwan is really the world's leading manufacturing hub of very high-end chips that come into our phones, our computers, our supercomputers, our cars, and more fridges and microwaves and whatnot. So if there were to be a conflict there, it would probably stop or at least decrease very significantly our ability to buy semiconductors. And so it would have a secondary effect on the price of a lot of things that we do take for granted and consume on a day-to-day basis in Canada. The final thing that I want to talk about in terms of context, and again, we're looking back before we look forward, is that same time last year, just a bit before then, President Biden decided that he would engage into this massive campaign that he's called the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a $400 billion stimulus package aimed at bringing back semiconductors, batteries, clean energy, clean vehicles onto American roads. But the thing is that $400 billion is a lot of money in a very short time span, and it's putting a lot of pressures on every other country, especially on Canada, because we're the next door neighbor. And so we had to kind of follow suit, right? So after recording record deficits during the pandemic, you'll remember $300 billion in deficits in Canada in 2020, we are finding it very, very difficult to get out of this kind of debt and deficit spiral at the Canadian level. And so we're seeing now what? Well, Ms. Freeland announced in last year's budget that Canada would allow $80 billion, which proportionally is a significant amount of money, to similar initiatives, climate spending, bringing clean manufacturing, battery warehouses and manufacturers into Canada, basically as a response to the American strategy there. And the same is happening in pretty much every province. By the way, you've seen the Ontarian government, you've seen the Quebec government dedicate billions and billions of dollars. And so what's that leading to is that we are finding it very difficult to get out of this deficit type of strategy at every level in the country. And it's kind of worrying down the road that our states at every level will have more indebtedness. So to conclude maybe this first part, I always like to say that we live in a world that is more volatile, more uncertain, more complex and more ambiguous than it's ever been. And I will, show you a little bit what that means in a couple of moments, but I'll be using that expression VUCA a lot. And I often use it when I speak with some of my clients doing strategic planning. The world is more volatile. There are indicators that show volatility on the stock market, in prices, and in a bunch of different factors in our lives. And it's difficult to forecast, which leads to uncertainty. We do not know exactly where things are going. There are more factors that come into play. I've spoken of Russia, China, America, COVID, which was difficult to forecast. And so this is leading to a complexity. And finally, there is ambiguity in that we don't necessarily know what to do. There's not necessarily an obvious right choice right now. So it's not, as economists like to say, we don't optimize under constraint with a single optimum. There are different optima that we need to choose between. And so this is a new reality that I think a lot of business leaders have to deal with. So focusing on Canada and obviously talking about more today and what's coming up, well, obviously the labor and housing situations are kind of worrying. And as you may know, there are different forecasts. This was from a couple of years ago, but now I think the population is just above 40 million. But there are scenarios that would lead the Canadian population to nearly double by 2068 to $70 million, the humans, inhabitants, not dollars. And so I don't know for you, but for me, 70 million is kind of it strikes the imagination, right? It's a lot of people, and so we're gonna have to bring these people in, or maybe we're gonna have more babies, but it's more likely going to come from immigration. And so we're going to have to welcome these people. We're going to have to put them somewhere. We're going to have to make them productive. We're going to have to, make sure that they are contributors to the Canadian society and the Canadian economy. And so that's a real challenge. And the other thing, the kind of downside to this, is that not only are we, well, on one side, we're growing the population, but on the other hand, we're seeing the number of people working, so the activity ratio, going down very significantly. Right now, it's below the number on the chart. It's around 65% on average in Canada, meaning that if you take 100 individuals in Canada, only 65 of them are working. Now, obviously, there are young people, there are old people, there are disabled people, there are a bunch of different scenarios, but you have to look at the big numbers. Around 65% of us right now are working. Now, the thing is that from 65, we will be going down and down and down over the next few decades to somewhere between 58 and 61%. And you may think that only 4 or 5% is not that much, but this is translated into millions of people who are not active into our economy. So it puts a lot of pressures on those who are active. And so challenges in terms of productivity, challenges in terms of automation, etc. And so I don't know how you guys deal in your different geographies, but with a lot of my clients, I hear a lot of talk right now about the labor shortage, right? We're having difficulty finding qualified labor, etc. It's everybody's fighting off for the same limited number of individuals. But as I like to say, we are unlikely to see such an abundance of workers again in our lifetime. So if you think that today is a labor shortage situation, just wait. 5 or 10 or 15 years from now, it's only going to get worse proportionally. So we really need to start finding solutions in terms of how we're going to combine a ratio of workers, so labor, with a ratio of capital and a ratio of innovation and productivity in order to make the few workers that remain, the 58 to 61%, a lot more productive than we are today. And so we need to change our mindset regarding labor very definitely. Now that's numbers, so bodies in the room, but I always like to say that it's not only numbers, it's also a qualitative game. And so I used to give talks a couple of years ago about generational gaps and generational differences and customer preferences and worker preferences. And I used to have this slide in my presentation saying they are coming, referring to Gen Z, these young people who are born and bred into a technological world with a lot more wealth than we had 20 or 30 year previous as a country, obviously. And so the thing now, they're not coming, obviously. Now they're here, and they're here with a very different relationship to work, which again is not just a quantitative question. It's also a largely qualitative topic. And here I am, with my blue tie, not really knowing what to do. Concretely, what that means, and one such manifestations of the change in behavior from the worker's point of view, is that over the last 150 years, as you may know, the amount of working hours per worker per annum has gone down significantly from 3,000 hours per year to just below 2,000 hours per year. Now, I'm not saying we should go back to 3,000, which is 60 hours a week, 50 weeks per year. You'll know the 1870s, it was a different era. But obviously what we're seeing in the very last few years, and if we zoom on the last couple of years, is that even at this very low, at this lower level, we've gone from 1827 hours per worker per year to 1696 over a period of about 35 years. And I don't have very recent data. This chart ends at 2017, but my understanding is that it's gone down even more over the last 5 years, thanks in part to the pandemic, thanks in part to the new generation coming into work. And so the thing is that for every worker that you have compared to the 1980s, you're getting 130 hours less work, which, is not a problem per se, but you need to, every 12, 13 employees bring in another employee to do the same amount of hours work than you used to a couple of decades ago. And so this is going to be an issue if it keeps going down as fast as the activity ratio that I was pointing out earlier. I personally work a lot more than 1696 hours per year. I always use this image that makes me laugh quite a bit, but I work a lot. I'm an entrepreneur, but I'm possibly not the typical worker for the Canadian economy today. What that means, though, is that the combination of less workers in proportion with less hours worked per worker is creating a lot of problems into our economy. And this is a funny title from the Capital Daily. Greater Victoria builders say they can't find workers to build new homes because they can't find homes for the worker. And so this is typically like, if you had more people working more hours more consistently, you wouldn't have these types of situations. But we're entering into this kind of spiral where you don't really know where to start, and we're going to start seeing this more and more in a variety of industries in the next few years, I believe. And so what's the situation? Well, the situation in the short term has been to bring in more people from the outside, right? And so if you look at the immigration level as part of the population, it's really interesting to see that in the obviously a century ago, we are a very small population. So the proportion of immigration to the current population was very, very significant. Now, obviously, the population has reached 35, 40 million, maybe 70 million in a couple of years down the road. So the proportion of immigration has been relatively low in proportion of the overall population, around 1%. Now, last year, we welcomed about 430,000 new inhabitants in Canada. And the intention, according to the Trudeau government, is to maintain this level for the foreseeable future at or just below 500,000 new arrival per year, which is great because it's bringing in labor. A lot of it is qualified. It's solving part of the problem. But as you know, obviously, we aren't able to produce enough homes for these people. So it begs the question, we're going to welcome them into our fabulous country. Where are we going to put them? And the thing is, and I'll be addressing the policy rate in a second, that with the current situation, with very high inflation and the necessity to bring this back down to a sustainable level, we've seen the policy rate go up a lot. And so that provides a disincentive to builders and promoters to put new homes on the market. And so it's creating an imbalance. And it's going to be the major situation that we're going to have to collectively address economically and socially in the next 2 to 5 years. What I'm seeing now, which is striking and kind of another tip of the iceberg, is a lot of entrepreneurs who are relying largely or partly on foreign labor, temporary or permanent immigrants. And what they do is they may be in a variety of industries like tourism or manufacturing or retail, they're buying homes. They've entered the real estate market. Why? Because they want to secure their ability to put their new workers somewhere. And so they're divesting from their main area of focus, buying homes, investing in real estate, just to secure their ability to have the workers to do the job. And that's relatively new and quite striking, as I said. So I've spoken at length about a variety of sectors, but I wanted to zoom a little bit about retail, and this is just an image that I that I like. But I was telling you guys earlier that we have seen volatility increase a lot over time, and in the VUCA expression, obviously volatility is the first word. We like to think that volatility is greater, but if you look at the variation of prices on the stock market, it's true, it's measurable. We're seeing the median volatility increase decade after decade for the last almost 3/4 of a century, which is exciting if you're a gambler and if you like to make a quick buck, but it's really destabilizing if you like to forecast and make a strategic plan and look forward and invest for the long run. So again, it's not just an impression, there's truth to the fact that volatility has increased. You may know an author called Douglas Rushkoff, which wrote a book in the early 2000s called Present Shock. And he has this quote that I really love. We like to think that the only constant is change, but we are wrong. Change is changing too. And I think we need to think about that when we are making our plans and looking forward to the future state of the economy. What is the change that I'm living through, but how is this change changing? What are new parameters? How is the uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity likely to impact my business looking forward? And so one thing that obviously is leading the charge in terms of volatility and that is creating a lot of uncertainty on the markets and for a lot of entrepreneurs is inflation. Now, I've been asked to comment inflation figures 1,000 times in the past year. It's an interesting space, right? Looking at the price index. And I always like to remind everyone that inflation, the headline inflation, the thing that we put on the first page of the newspaper, is a very poor indicator of how the economy is doing. And I can assure you that when the Bank of Canada is making decisions, they don't really consider the headline inflation that much. They look at other measurements. And so when we break down inflation into several parts, what we see, and these are numbers for the United States, is that not all services or products increase or decrease at the same rate. So obviously in the States, what we've seen in the last 20 so years is that all services have very significantly increased in price. So you think of college, you think of hospital, you think of childcare, you think of a bunch of things. And obviously a lot of that, if you think of it from the Canadian context, we don't really have as much, right? Our hospital service are largely free. Our tuition is a lot more reasonable than it is in the States. Obviously, textbooks, etc., are the same here. But again, we're kind of immune to a lot of these inflationary pressures. And on the other hand, obviously, cars, clothing, phone services, toys, etc., in real dollars have really come down quite a lot. So although inflation is persistent, not all the categories move in the same direction, and we need to be mindful of that. It's just an average, right? And so your behavior as an individual, a citizen, but also as a business leader can completely change the way that inflation is impacting you. So what does that say? Well, obviously, we had some new inflation data earlier this week. Apparently, the headline inflation in Canada is now at 4%. But if you break it down a little bit, what's gone up? Well, food is still going up a little bit by 6.some%. Gas or energy into your cars and vehicles has gone up a little bit, about 1% over the previous year. But what's really driving inflation right now in Canada is housing. And why is housing driving inflation up? Because of the Bank of Canada's strategy. So it's kind of a paradox in which the Bank of Canada is trying to fight inflation, but in doing so, it's raising the rate that is creating inflation. And so it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that we're just going to have to play through over the next 12 to 18 months. So the Bank of Canada, as you know, has increased its rate super fast. And what's really striking for me Well, two things. The first is that this is not the first time that the Bank of Canada increases the rate really fast. If you look at the 80s, at the 90s, even at the mid 70s, there were periods where we went from 6 to 9, or from, if you look at the early 80s, from 10 to 20 almost. What's really different is the pace at which it's gone. So it was over basically 10 months, started in March 2022, ended in December 2022. There were a couple of hikes further down the line in the early part of 2023, but the gist of it, the most significant part of it, was over a very, very short time span. And the other thing is that we started from zero. So obviously, if your rate goes from 10 to 15%, it will generate a 30-some% increase into your mortgage payment. If your rate goes from 0.25 to 5, the policy rate, it's going to generate a 60% increase into your mortgage payment. And so this is really putting a lot of pressure on Canadian households, and it's kind of unprecedented as well. So it's making it very difficult to forecast, both from the individual's point of view, from the business leader's point of view, and even from the economist's point of view. And this is something I published in April this year, saying that the Bank of Canada would cut rates before the end of 2023. They've heightened them twice ever since. So again, I'm somebody who's spending a lot of time looking at the data, thinking about what Mr. Macklem is doing, how the Canadian economy is performing, and I got it completely wrong. So again, if I can get it completely wrong, imagine anybody who's not necessarily very well versed into economics doesn't necessarily know what's happening, and it's just basically on the receiving end of that. And so why am I telling you all of this is because right now the goal of the Bank of Canada's policy is to really slow down consumption. You should stop buying cars and running shoes and a bunch of things. And so its primary target, its primary victim is really the retail industry. It's like they're like waging a war on retail, basically. And so it's going to be very interesting for me looking at the data in the coming months to see how retail as an industry as a whole is able to withstand this attack on its way of life. Because basically, if my mortgage payment is 30% higher than it was last year, well, where am I going to spend less? I'm going to obviously spend less into things that I would probably buy into retail. There's not much other places where I can cut very simply. I'm not going to cut necessarily on food. I'm not going to necessarily cut on gas and energy and a bunch of very primary things. So I'm going to cut on things that are, non-essential, which is basically what part of the retail industry is doing. And so the retailers and distributors are like kind of, the as I said, almost the victims of this strategy. And it's going to be, again, very interesting to see what the numbers reveal and what the strategies reveal in terms of fighting this back. As you may know, if you look at different brands in Canada right now, who's winning this war in terms of retailers and distributors? Well, the low cost, right? Dollarama is doing super well. Super C is doing super well. Amazon is obviously doing super well. Why? Because they have a cheaper price policy, obviously, than others. And I wouldn't be surprised to see Walmart go, all out, obviously, because they're in people's mind associated with this ability to distribute at large scale at a very low price. So again, there's going to be winners and losers out of that, and we're going to have to see how it plays out. So if we look forward a little bit in terms of strategy, well, as you may know, this old saying, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the second best time to plant a tree is today, right? So I get a lot of people asking me, Francis, should I buy real estate? Francis, should I invest in technology or automation, or should I, buy another company, etc.? The rates are high. It's difficult maybe to consider making a profit with such financing rate, etc. We're seeing capex go down quite a bit. So again, I wanted to address that a little bit from the strategic point of view. As you may know, a bunch of companies, household names, were born during striking economic crises, right? And were very successful. So again, if you are in a positive mindset, there may be extraordinary opportunities during a slowdown to launch something. So again, how do you launch something? Do you quit your job? Do you create something outside? Do you launch a spin-off? Do you make a joint venture? Do you invest a little bit in R&D? I don't know. You can own your own process. But my point is a lot of companies were born out of these periods of difficult times. Brittany, I see that you're back. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, we have lots of comments. Fascinating.
Okay.
Okay, one of them is technology increasing transmission of risk and hence volatility? And is this expected to increase with AI?
Okay. Tough question. I uh, hmm. Technology is definitely contributing to volatility for many reasons. First, as an industry, it's quite volatile because it's typically, and we've seen it with a bunch of companies in the past, based on the promise of future earnings, which may or may not be realized, right? So we typically, the tech startup, right, promises to become the next billion-dollar companies. It either does or it doesn't. But again, this generates kind of a high expectation and low probability of a realization. So again, it's generating a lot of VUCA. It's generating a lot of volatility, but also of uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So this is technology as a whole, but what we're seeing more and more is that some parts of technologies are starting to behave more like mature industries. If you look at the streaming wars, for instance, well, we're starting to see, there are 3, 4, 5 major players. They're, playing on the margins, gaining 1%, 2%, making some profit, losing a bit of money, but it's not they are not startups anymore. And the streaming industry, for instance, is not necessarily something that's going to, it's not as disruptive as it was 10 or 15 years ago, right? It's established itself into a more mature space. AI is obviously the wild card here. I'm very interested, for instance, to look at NVIDIA's performance, for instance. As you know, they're a chip manufacturer. They produce cards that are a very significant factor of production, a factor of generation in the world of AI. Their stock price is completely, out of, it's in a stratosphere, obviously, compared to their earnings or to their revenues. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I feel that there may be, and you may or may not share my view on this, but there may be an overhype type of situation around AI. Not that it's not a thing, but I just think the period that it's going to be, the period over which it's going to become the very large industry that it promises to be, maybe considered too enthusiastically. I don't think it's going to become as big as we think it is over 18 months. So obviously, NVIDIA is going to see its sales increase, but I don't think they're going to multiply by 10 over the next 2 years, which would place them in a more rational type of EBITDA multiplier situation. So again, that's a wild card on the industrial side. In terms of how AI will affect our industries and our ability to work, it depends. I did a whole study on the advertising market, which is very niche, but one of my clients is an association of advertisers. They asked me, how will AI change the way we do things? And so obviously it will simultaneously change a lot of things, but a lot of them will have to remain exactly the same, right? So, I mean, a lot of people will be more efficient, may lose their job, but again, it's not going to necessarily multiply it's not going to change the face of the industry, because it's still a very relational industry, still requires a lot of human input. So there are a couple of tasks that you can make more efficient. There can be some gains, but it's not a complete game changer for them, at least not in the next 5 years. Now, ask me again in 2028, I might have a different answer for you. But it's still a very human, personal type of industry. It may be different for others. I'm not an expert in every single one of them, but I think this is definitely something to keep our eye on. Not only, this conference is about 2023, 2025. I think within this time frame, it's still going to be like a widget. I use ChatGPT every day, but I mean, I'm still here, and I don't earn 3 times as much now that I do. So it's just a helpful tool.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you very much.
All right. I'm nearly done, Brittany. So if there are any more questions or debates to be had, I'll happily take questions in about 5 minutes. So just coming back, basically, best time to plant a tree. So a lot of great companies were born during periods of slowdown or recession, or where the economy was not in such a great space. And so if you look a little bit at one of the models that I really love, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Clayton Christensen's work. He was a professor at Harvard. He's died now, but he wrote an extraordinary book called The Innovator's Dilemma, which you may have heard of. And if you read the book and you understand this model quite well, in pretty much every product, in every sector, there is an existing model, series of processes, way to do things. And eventually you reach a certain plateau, decreasing marginal returns, like we say in economics. So basically, the more input you put into the industry or the product, the less revenue or the less profit it's going to generate. So basically, you start plateauing. It can happen after a year, after 5 years, after 20 years. It really depends. But inevitably, pretty much every industry behaves like that. So they reach a plateau. And so what you need to do when you start seeing that plateau is to start investing in other technologies, in other products, in other industries that will generate a second S curve that at a higher level. The problem is that this is a 2D graph, but for every S curve that's going to bring you all the way up there, there's 2, 5, 10, 20 other S curves that's just going to, bring you all the way down. And so it's going to rush a little bit. But if you don't do anything, your plateaued business might just die. So you basically need to invest during this short period of time where you see the innovator's dilemma. You need to invest in technologies and products and industries that you don't understand as well, that are generating less revenue per dollar spent, that are basically not very great ROIs. But if you don't invest in them at this phase of maturity decline, you will never know or never find out what the new S curve is. And so you're likely gonna see your old business model collapse. So you need to invest in things with a lesser ROI than your main attraction or your main product today. And so how do we do this? Well, obviously, typically companies invest very strictly in capex, right? They will buy new machines, they will have new software, they will do AI, as we said. They'll do a bunch of non-residential fixed investments. So they'll invest in any type of capital expenditure, depending on your industry, to make their workers more productive, right? The ratio of capital to worker is generally a good indicator of productivity. So you need to invest in capital to make your workers more efficient. And the thing is that even though the cash at hand that large companies has decreased a little bit after the pandemic, it's still twice as much as it was a decade ago. So companies in the US, part of the S&P 500, have just over $14 trillion of cash at hand. So they have money to invest. They just need to find the opportunities and the courage to invest in these, second S curve in order to find out what the next big thing is. So obviously, we've seen over the past 2 years large problems with supply chain. It's kind of being resolved right now. Hopefully the situation in Detroit is not too problematic. But obviously, we're going to see a lot of opportunities, and those who are able to seize them during this period are going to be the winners at the end. The thing is that if you wait for rates to come down, and that's true in capex expenditures as it is in real estate, by the way, if you wait for the rates to come down, if you wait for the price to stabilize, if you wait for the economy to start going up again, you're going to miss the window. Why? Because those who are investing right now are going to be a mile ahead of you. And by the time you catch up, it's going to be quote unquote too late. So recessions or slowdowns are a great period to try new things, to invest in capex, to relaunch new business models, to develop new products and services. And again, there's a lot of money available for this. If I can take a step back actually and resume a little bit what I've been saying, we are living in a period of very highly available, abundant capital and very low shortage of labor, which is interesting when you think about it, because if our problem is productivity, we have a lot of capital and little labor, well, maybe we should just put the two together and find a way to make each other more productive. And so again, I think there's going to be a resolution over the next decade or so where we're going to equalize things so that the labor doesn't feel so problematic and the capital maybe goes down a little bit, because it's not very productive to keep so much cash into your bank account in the end. And in terms of investment, obviously, it's changing the portrait as well. There used to be kind of this linear relationship between, at one end, the venture capital situation, and at the other end, the philanthropy aspect. So what we're seeing more and more is these large, either publicly funded or even in the private sector, large investment funds who are playing the game of what we call patient capital that is a bit more long-term. So we're seeing more and more, for instance, 7-year windows instead of 3 to 5-year windows, and capital that is considering the social impact of their investments as well. And as you may know, the spat between DeSantis and Larry Fink in the US, between the governor of Florida and the CEO of BlackRock, which is holding nearly $10 trillion in capital, is about that. Should we allow patient capital to exist? Well, BlackRock is saying yes, and a lot of teachers funds, CDPQ in Quebec, PSP investments, etc., are saying yes as well. So we're seeing a lot more money available to finance long-term socially impactful projects. And so if you're able to frame what you're doing in terms of something that's beyond the next quarter, but looking into development over the very long term, well, I think there's money to be had, right? Money to be found, and investment partners to be partnering up with. A couple of years ago, software as a service, and then car as a service, and businesses as services were all the rage. And so there was kind of this spectrum, if you will, from at one end having your own car and at the other end having a taxi and everything in between, right? And so there was this meme on internet basically saying, Airbnb, the world's largest accommodation provider, owns no real estate, Facebook, Uber, Alibaba. It was all fun and games. And then suddenly came along Amazon, who just has a lot of inventory. And he's not the richest man alive. I think he's the third richest man alive. But the proof of the pudding is that there's not only one way to go about it, right? This idea that you can build giant unicorn companies without owning anything is one way to go about it. But I think there are many other ways that go through capex, inventory, having stuff on your books, etc. And so I don't think we need to be naive in thinking that the only way to go is to build software companies. There is still a future for people who build things. I strongly believe in that. And my final point regarding the future, obviously, and I don't think I'm naive, McKinsey wrote recently in a very lengthy report that we need to finance and we need to spend massively on physical assets for energy. And they estimate that between now and 2050, so over the next 3 decades, we need collectively worldwide to spend $3.5 trillion in order to do that. It's half of global corporate profits. Now, you may not go to half in your particular case. I probably will not, but we're going to have to invest very massively in this. And the good news is that we're seeing a lot of these new technologies, especially on the right-hand side, wind, battery, and solar, whose price per megawatt has gone very, very rapidly down over the last few decades. And we're now seeing other technologies who are like on the verge of breakthroughs, like fuel cell stacks and electrolyzers, etc., whose price and efficiency are also coming down very significantly. Now, you may not be in the energy industry, but as you know, energy is going to be one of the very critical discussions of the 21st century. Obviously, the trade-off between oil and gas and clean energy on one end, but just the fact that we're kind of running short of energy globally. If you are in Ontario, if you are in Eastern Canada, if you're in Quebec, we're seeing this era of abundant, cheap electricity kind of come to an end, right? And we're trying to export more to the United States. We're seeing a lot of companies who are entering into decarbonization processes. We're seeing all this new trend towards batteries and electric vehicles, etc. That's really booming. And again, the energy to fuel these different technologies in these different industries is going to be a critical question. So again, how do you position yourself with this set of prices coming down? How is your energy input more or less clean? How is your industry migrating towards these different new trends? Whether you like this trend or not, it's happening, right? And so there's something to be had there. And I think we need to keep our eye on this very massive revolution in terms of industry, production, and investment as well. So Canada 2025. I like to think, and it's going to end on a high note, as they say, I like to think that we're kind of in a tri-witch. I don't know if you guys have made tri-witch before, but we're here, right? We're in the middle of the tri-witch. And so on one hand, we have the European situation with Vladimir Putin, who's invaded Ukraine, who's kind of cut off Germany from cheap oil and gas, meaning that the price of energy in Germany has gone really up a lot. And so it's kind of slowing down Germany, who's not as able to produce cheaply, to export through the world, cars and engineering, etc. So it's really a big problem. And we're going to see probably Germany in a recession by the end of this year. Germany is the locomotive of Europe. So it's really creating a lot of issues. And again, it's starting from this guy, but it's really the entire European region who's kind of in a trouble. You've seen last week that the European Central Bank has increased its policy rate, and the euro fell. So there's a lot of doubt in the international market that Europe is going to be able to walk out of this unscathed. And so we're going to have to really keep an eye on what Vladimir Putin and a bunch of other leaders, but I'm just using him as a ultimate culprit, is going to do, and how this kind of situation is going to play out, because obviously European may be a little bit further, but it's still a significant partner, and again, a large influence on worldwide affairs. On the other side, you have this guy, Xi Jinping, who's also in a bit of a troubled situation. As you know, zero COVID policy, as I mentioned, went on for a lot longer than it could have, or maybe should have. But also, you're seeing the real estate sector in China really in a very troublesome position. A lot of people are who are in the emerging middle class are at risk of losing their life saving. That's going to be a bit problem, both economically and politically. The situation in Taiwan is not doing well. And so what we're seeing right now in China, contrary to a lot of other countries, is something like deflation coming around the block. So deflation is very bad for China, but it could have a very positive and good impact on us, because obviously, if you're seeing deflated products being exported from China back into the States and into Canada, that's going to be cheaper prices, and it's going to mean obviously cheaper, lower indexes. So it could mean by the middle of 2024 that we're going to see TIF Macklem and the Bank of Canada feel a bit more relaxed if this is to happen. Now, it could yield a lot of political unrest on the Western Front. And you know probably that the Chinese-Canadian relationship is a bit tense as well. So that's going to be something to keep an eye on. And finally, we have our friends to the south, unavoidable. The elections are a year and some days away, so it's going to be a very spectacular election, I'm sure, as you can imagine. And again, depending on who's elected, it's going to change policy from one direction to the other. Our relationship with the Americans, our ability to export a lot of our primary goods, that's going to be more or less easy. And obviously, Mr. Trump, as we've seen in his first mandate, could go in every other direction with a lot of our other partners. So that's a lot of VUCA for you. So I'd like to thank you guys. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and you feel free to write me on LinkedIn, email, Facebook, or whatever if you want to follow the conversation in the next few days. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. Yeah, we do have a couple of questions. So to start, can you comment on Canada's competitiveness relation to other G20 nations and our ability to stay ahead?
Our G20 is a large group.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, we're above the average, but we're not the best, right? And one of the big issues is that we're a very low R&D country, a very low productivity country. We do have a lot of natural resources. Energy's been a lot of our, it's explained a lot of our collective success, but in Ontario and Quebec, elsewhere, lumber. And so we've seen the fires this summer is going to affect this industry quite significantly. We need to kind of walk away from the resource obsession and into more intellectual property, into more services. And that's difficult to negotiate politically, for one, but also because a lot of provinces are, very well attached to the resources that they provide. And because it's also a question of regional development, right? I'll speak for Quebec that I know well. I'm from here, but people who live in Abitibi or Saguenay or whatever, like really far up north, if you take away the lumber and the mining industries, there's not much left, right? So you'll basically kill the towns, kill the cities, and so they don't want that. So they will fight for the right to keep exploiting the resources, which again they have every right to. But my point is that if we're moving into a 21st century artificial intelligence led value generation economics, I think lumber as proportional to every other industry is going to take a hit, right? There's going to be less demand for it and the prices are likely to go down. So again, if we want to move to more towards the front of the pack, we need to invest significantly more into R&D, into innovation, into intellectual property. We're finding hard to negotiate that because a lot of our resources are going towards primary resources or very basic manufacturing. It is what it is. I mean, we're a wealthy country. We're happy to be here. I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but if we really want to take that next step, we're going to have to move very significantly. On a plus side, though, I was listening to a podcast, I think from the New York Times recently. In the United States, they're seeing college enrollments go down. Obviously because price is a big factor, and because the advantage of going to college compared to the advantage of not going to college has lessened a lot over the last few decades. Obviously because the prices have gone up so much, and so they're seeing a decrease in the number of enrollments in colleges. We're not seeing that in Canada. So although we're not doing as much R&D and research, etc., we're seeing the diplomacy rates maintain and even increasing year after year. And I think, a smart and an educated population is definitely a good thing several decades into the future. But again, this is much beyond my usual purview of planning what's going to happen in 2040 or 2050.
Gotcha. Thank you. Couple more questions. How will eventually of the central bank digital currencies impact Canadian productivity and or the directing of consumer spending?
Digital currency, I don't know what we're talking about necessarily. If we're talking about Bitcoin or any other, I don't think it's gonna. It's a personal view, but I don't think it's going to have a massive impact. It's a means of payment. You can pay in Bitcoin if you like, if that rocks your boat. I don't think it's a value generating industry by any means. It's taking a lot of energy to basically print virtual things, which is, I'm not against it. It's just not generating any jobs. It's not generating very marginal profit. It's fluctuating a lot. And so in this VUCA world that we described, Bitcoin is the perfect embodiment, or Ethereum or whatever. Like it's fluctuating. It's very difficult to forecast. It's unpredictable. It's complex to understand for me. Imagine for my mom. So again, we're it's not going to change the Canadian GDP, if I can put it that way. It could facilitate a lot of things, a lot of transactions, storage of value, etc. But I don't think it's going to change the portrait. It's more for me a supporting act than at the forefront of Canadian growth or Canadian productivity.
Yeah, we got the update. Not crypto, but central bank digital currencies. You to add to that.
Let's Sean, write to me on LinkedIn. We can talk about that. I am really interested in this space, but I think this is maybe too narrow a question. I don't have the
offline, Sean, you can connect with Francis. We have one more question you probably see. Can you comment on where you think the price of natural gas and electricity will go in the next 3 to 5 years?
That's the big question, honestly. For me, energy is the key question for the next century. Actually, we're going to need more energy. We're going to need new types of energy. I believe, whether I'm right or not, that the decarb agenda is going to remain there. We're going to want to decarbonize our industries, aluminum and iron and energy production, obviously. And for that, we're going to need more energy. Now, there are problems, as you can imagine. Building dams is complex, super expensive, and compared to what we were doing in the 50s and 60s, where we could get kilowatts for a cent or a cent and a half, it now costs 6, 7, 8 cents per kilowatt to exploit. And in Canada, we have a strange situation where we're basically dumping our energy, right? We're giving the electricity away. So we're going to have to see so your question is how the prices, so I'm assuming wholesale prices, but I think we're going to have a reflection on retail prices as well. I don't think as we are organized around public monopolies, more or less, in the energy industry in Canada, are going to be able to withstand for a very long time operations that are building dams at 8 cents and selling at 7. It doesn't make much sense. So we're going to have to see these prices go up and down. And as we do, either the demand is going to be reduced, or we're going to see, strategies of efficiency, or, the different strategies obviously coming about. What I'm really worried about, though, in the short term, and what we're seeing in several provinces here and in Europe as well, is the availability of energy. Right now, there's a limited amount of energy being produced, and we have demand for more than is available. And obviously, as if you're a specialist in the world of electricity, there's energy, so it's the quantity of electrons, but there's power at any given time. And obviously, as we are going through very harsh winters, especially in eastern provinces, we see the peak power demand go up and beyond what is available. So we're going to have to start thinking of ways of reducing the power demand and generating more energy over the long run. But again, these are massive investments that require several years to be, built. There's social acceptability issues with, a bunch of different stakeholders. It's not given that it's going to happen. I'll just speak to Quebec very briefly, but we even, Quebec has been historically 99.7% renewable and very largely focused on hydroelectricity. But what we're seeing now with the new head of Hydro-Quebec is we're starting to explore the possibility of reactivating the nuclear production capacity, which in Ontario is kind of a boring thing to say, but here it's kind of a shift, a complete shift in the way that we see things. I also did a study recently about new renewable energies, and I was surprised to find out that Alberta is leading the Canadian pack in terms of geothermic exploration and geothermic technologies. So you would think that a nation that has abundant oil and gas would, be focused on that. But again, there is, as in many countries, the possibility of using this abundant resource to kind of start focusing on developing new technologies and to eventually lead the pack back and exporting these technologies from province to province and eventually to the world. So I'm gonna be very interested to see how that plays out. But again, I work with Hydro-Quebec and Rio Tinto and a bunch of these players. So I'm fascinated by the future of energy and electricity, but it's not a simple question. So something to read certainly a lot about over the next few years.
No, thank you, Francis. Nothing is ever a super easy answer sometimes, but thank you for all your insights. I know there was a lot of people inquiring on LinkedIn if the session will be recorded, and it will be. And we are just at the top of the hour, so we'll close up here. And thank you for everyone who's tuned in. And thank you, Francis, for your very tailored insights, not only just to our Tech Canada members, but to anyone here on the call listening. So yeah, thanks for everyone who attended today's Deeper Insights webinar series. The session has been recorded, will be available on our website and on YouTube channel, and you can view our ever-growing library of over 50 episodes. So thank you, Francis. Thank you to everyone on this call, and hope everyone has a wonderful day.